I want to talk just briefly about the question of the reliability of the Gospels. How much confidence can we have in the content of these books? Now, this is a much too massive topic to address in a very short way, but even at the risk of it being too much of a surface treatment, I would like to focus in on one particular line of reasoning with respect to the trustworthiness of the Gospels. And I've always found this one fascinating. If you look at the Gospels, I think, and I presented this in prior presentations on the Synoptic Gospels, but I think that there's a good case that can be made that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all written sometime in the 60s, maybe, in my own view, because of the ending of the book of Acts, as taking us to about 60 to 62 A.D., and the destruction of the temple being in 70 A.D., and that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I'm convinced, do not talk about the destruction of the temple as something that's already happened. They do tell us Jesus' Olivet Discourse, where he speaks about the coming destruction of the temple, but none of them speak about it as something that has already transpired or already occurred. So, in my mind, Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all written sometime in the 60s of the first century, probably in the early 60s. But even if we expand that, to be the 60s and the 70s, or maybe even the early 80s of the first century. It seems interesting to me that if we look at the background to that period of time, those decades of 60s, 70s, 80s of the first century, I think any historian of early Christianity would say that the first great struggle of Christian theology, of Christian faith, of defining themselves for Christians, the first great struggle was with how Christians understood themselves in relationship to the Jewish faith. Because Christianity grows out of Judaism, it grows out of the experience of Israel's history, and then Christ as bringing that history to a new moment. Because that's the context of Christian theology and early Christian development, that's what initially defines who they are. And so many of the writings of the New Testament are written out of that experience of defining themselves in relationship to Judaism. So, for example, if you look at the book of Galatians, for instance, that's perhaps a classic example of Paul, the Apostle Paul, struggling with a group of Christian believers who are being drawn back into Jewish practices that Paul argues are now nullified, or they are fulfilled or completed in the coming of Jesus. And so, and at the center of that whole thing in Galatians, but also elsewhere, we see evidence of it in Colossians, we see evidence of it in Ephesians, we see evidence of it in Romans, we see evidence of it in the book of Acts. We see evidence of this struggle between Judaism and Christianity, or Christians defining themselves in relationship to Judaism. We find evidence of it all of the New Testament. And the centerpiece of that debate is the Jewish ritual of circumcision, of ritual circumcision. Circumcision was a sign. We could talk about the specific meaning of this, but circumcision was a sign, a religious sign for Judaism that goes all the way back to the early periods of their history, to Abraham, who was told by God, we're told in the book of Genesis, to have his son circumcised. And then Moses, of course, made it an essential component of the Mosaic covenant in the Old Testament. So circumcision was an essential ritual of the Jewish faith, and it was a sign, the practice of circumcision was a sign of one's commitment to following the whole law of Moses. And so Paul engages in a very sophisticated theological debate with this whole idea of, are Christians obligated to follow these Old Testament ritual signs, or have they somehow been surpassed, or has something now happened that renders them obsolete or no longer in force or binding on Christians? It's hard for us to understand the intensity of this particular debate and this particular discussion, because most of us don't grow up with, in a Jewish context where that becomes such an essential part of a sign of their religious faith and of their history and of their relationship to God, if they take their religion very seriously. So, but in the first century, this would have been extremely intense, because the early Christians, of course, were by and large Jews who had accepted Christianity, and now they were struggling to try to understand what their Christianity means in relationship to their former Jewish way of life. And so you see the evidence of this struggle all throughout the New Testament. Eventually, when we get to the year 90 A.D., at the so-called Council of Jamnia, The Jews, or the ancient Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, after the fall of the temple in Jerusalem, finally they are going to essentially define Christianity or Christians as being outside of the context of Judaism, so that if you are a Christian, you cannot be classified as a Jew. But this is a deep and serious struggle that's going on there. What I find particularly fascinating is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John for that matter, are all written while that debate is raging within the church, within Christianity. So that debate is going on, and yet in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, we do not find specific reference to the debate, for example, over circumcision. In fact, we don't even find great debate about the meaning of the Old Testament law. We see Jesus challenging various aspects of it that ultimately bring him to the point of death. But we don't find the New Testament writers bringing in the terms of that debate over the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. We don't see them bringing in the terms of that debate into the Gospels. We do see it in the various letters of the New Testament, like Galatians and Romans and so on. But we don't find it in the Synoptic Gospels. And I think that's enormously significant. Why so? Because it means that even though Matthew, for example, or Mark, was writing his gospel when these questions were burning in the minds of Christians and Jews and how they're related to each other, even though those questions are burning in their mind, the writers do not insert the answer to those particular questions into the mouth of Jesus as they write about his teachings. So in other words, nowhere do you find Jesus saying what approach we should take, for example, to the ritual of circumcision. Nowhere does Jesus talk about that issue, which is a remarkable silence, given the fact that those are the things that are going on in the world. Those are the questions that are being asked and being debated within the Jewish and Christian communities, and they're defining the relationship between them. So in the Gospels, even though they're writing about Christ and his teachings and writing about Jews and their teachings, they never talk about that debate in the terms of the time period in which those books were written. In other words, we don't find any kind of obvious evidence of anachronistic reading into the Gospels, future controversies and debates. Instead, we find an effort to hold on to, I believe, the teachings of Jesus without distorting those teachings in the terms that will arise later in other theological debates and contexts. Let me give you one other example of this that I think is a good example. And that is, when you look at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but also the Gospel of John, you see that Jesus most frequently refers to himself as the Son of Man. And I think there's some great significance to that, theological significance to it, and maybe in a future presentation we can talk about that. But whatever the meaning of it is, Jesus calls himself Son of Man. I think some 70 some odd times in the Gospels, Jesus refers to himself as Son of Man. Outside of the Gospels, in the other writings of the New Testament, Jesus is almost never called Son of Man. Instead, he's called, the favorite names for Jesus are Lord and Christ. Christ being a Greek form, a Greek word in the place of the Hebrew word that we translate or put as Messiah, which means anointed one. The word Christ, or Christos, the Greek word, means anointed one. And so Christ and Messiah are equivalent words. And so they like to speak of Jesus as the Messiah or the Christ, or speak of him as Lord, a word meaning master, or sometimes has overtones of deity, of divine origin. And so they like to refer to him as Lord and Messiah, but rarely do they refer to him as Son of Man. But in the Gospels, almost always Jesus refers to himself as Son of Man, and almost never refers to himself as Lord and Christ. These are fascinating observations. I think they're enormously interesting, that it suggests to me, and to many others, that Jesus, when he refers to himself as Son of Man in the Gospels, it's because those books are wanting to tell us exactly what Jesus said about himself. And therefore, they use the language that Jesus would have used about himself instead of using the patterns or tendencies of later periods of time to call him Lord and Christ. Now, I would suggest very quickly about that referring to himself as Lord and Christ, I don't believe is deviating from Jesus' meaning when he calls himself Son of Man. I think there is a very rich theological significance to Son of Man that really combines elements of Lord and Christ into a single term. And so I think Lord and Christ are consistent with Son of Man. But the only point I'm making here is that the language itself that the gospel writers use to talk about Jesus' words, I think, are the words that Jesus would have used to talk about himself, and therefore they're very careful not to read their practices back into the exact words that Jesus used about himself. So those are a couple of observations about the historical trustworthiness of the Gospels, and I think they're fascinating. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are many other things to consider, but those are a couple to think about.